Hello and welcome to today's webinar on establishing a field of Iranian environmental history and to learn from Professor James Gustafson's book, The Lion and the Sun. I'm eager to learn about this topic given Iran's rich history and unique and multifaceted environment. But before we begin, I want to mention that our audience members can submit their questions via the Q&A section of the webinar and via email, and questions can be sent in English as well as in Farsi. Lastly, I want to say thank you to those who made this program possible, the Jalinus family for their support of the Georgetown University Persian Studies program in making this program possible, and the leadership of Farima Mustafi, professor and director at the Persian Studies program here at Georgetown. I will hand it over to her now to begin our program.
خانم ها آقایان سلام. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Establishing a Field of Iranian Environmental History, James Gustafson, The Lion and the Sun, our 25th Jalinus lecture series in the form of a webinar. We really appreciate your presence today and your interest in our cultural events. We are planning to have a few more events this semester that you will receive information on soon. Let me also extend my gratitude to Shahrzad and Farhad Jalinus, that without their help, these cultural events would not have taken place. Now I am pleased to welcome our panelists, Dr. Camille, Dr. James Gustafson, and Dr. Afshin Marashi, and present you our moderator, Dr. Belle Cheves. Dr. Cheves is the Roshan Institute Assistant Professor in Persian and Iranian Studies in the Department of History, the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies, and the School of Global Studies at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on kinship and labor in modern Iran. Her first book, provisionally titled Qajar Affects, Making, Remembering, and Racializing the Family in Iran, investigates the emotional and affective structures that shape royal and elite household dynamics in 19th century Qajar Iran, and how they are represented in post-Qajar collective memory and nostalgia. I turn to you, dear Dr. Cheves, and thank you all for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Farima, and also Janan. And thank you to the Persian Studies program at Georgetown for hosting this event. It's my honor to moderate it as part of Georgetown's Persian Studies program's annual Jalinus Lecture Series. Today, we have a fantastic group of panelists, and feel free to turn your cameras on for the time being, panelists, to discuss establishing a field of Iranian environmental history, James Gustafson's The Lion and the Sun, and including the author himself, of course, as part of our panel today. James will first give a brief overview of the book, and then I'll introduce each panelist in turn, who will speak for a few minutes about their impressions of his work. Their realms of expertise span Iran's modern history, as well as a broader environmental history of the Middle East. We'll then have a discussion of the work and what it means to establish this field of Iranian environmental history, and then we'll open questions to everyone. Please feel free, as Janan said, to use the Q&A function at any point, and I will collate the questions to ask our panelists when the time comes. I'd first like to introduce Dr. James Gustafson, the Royden Davis Visiting Professor of Persian and Iranian History at Georgetown University. His usual academic home is at Indiana State University, where he serves as an associate professor in the history department. The Lion and the Sun, Environmental History and the Formation of Modern Iran, which I highly recommend reading if you haven't yet, is his second monograph. And I'll turn it over to him now to tell you more about it.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you to really three dear friends and colleagues, Belle, Afshin, and Camille, for being here and participating in this today to help give a broad view within and beyond Iranian studies of my new book. So this book, The Lion and the Sun, is my modest attempt to pull together research by colleagues that we can claim under the large umbrella of environmental history. And I really intend this as sort of a starting point for the development of a field of Iranian environmental history. So I apologize if the title of this webinar sounds a little pompous. It's more like this is the first step to establishing what I hope to be a vibrant field of Iranian environmental history. It's something that's still sort of in development at this point. And especially, with the state of foreign affairs and Iranian-American relations, there's something of a difficult situation with accessing archives and, of course, the research ecosystem within Iran. So in part, one of the things that I love about environmental history is it allows us to reevaluate things, to use sources that are already familiar and in circulation in new and creative ways by asking new types of questions. So this book actually grew out of a conversation over coffee that I had with a dear friend in my institution in Indiana, Dr. Jim Spear, who's an expert in dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. I noted that there is this rich literature on climate change in the early modern world. And I wanted to find ways that I could, that we could collaborate across disciplines that often don't speak with one another very deeply, the environmental sciences and the humanities, and see how we can draw out a picture of how Iran fits into stories of climate change in the early modern world, especially around the question of the Little Ice Age, where there's this long period of global cooling that had a sort of effect of erratic disruptions to climate patterns, not just cooling, but like with global warming today, a sort of disruption of long-term patterns in climate that had a broad impact on the 17th century world at its peak, in the period where we have in the mid-1600s a convergence of all of these rural uprisings, revolutions, and crises taking place across the Northern Hemisphere. And yet Iran, which of course was one of the great powers of the early modern world, is strangely absent from this literature. There's this rich literature around the late Safavid period, framed around the question of decline, but little of that literature really deals with the environmental context of how Iran relates to the Little Ice Age crisis. And so, Iran is really unique as an environmental zone and seems, in fact, quite vulnerable to the types of disruptions that were brought by climate change that we can kind of more richly document for, say, northern China or Western and Central Europe around the same time. And in fact, Iran in general has been sort of absent from global studies of environmental history. So this was sort of an attempt to integrate the Iranian plateau into a global study of environmental change in the modern period. It hedges on questions of global inequality and how we relate to our environments over long periods of time. Some really crucial questions in world historiography that Iran is, in fact, I believe, central to. So the Iranian plateau is a particularly interesting case study, in part because of some of the unique features, right, of much of the area east of the Zagros mountain range is like a rain shadow that extends into Central Asia and experiences water scarcity. Much of the agriculture in Iran is actually dependent on subterranean irrigation, like literally mining water out of the ground in order to support agriculture. So really kind of on the margins with water scarcity. There's also a prevalence of mobile pastoralism, that is, people who migrate seasonally with large herds of animals to try to eke out a survival and living off of seasonal grasses, and that often through their mobility and adaptability have a different sort of relationship with empire. And of course, you also have this zone of exception, as you saw on this map here. This is, along the northern part of the Iranian plateau near the Caspian Sea, really cut off from a lot of the rest of the Iranian plateau by the Alborz Mountains. You have this site of exception where you have the rich rainforests and dense, jangal of northern Iran. So we have this really interesting environmental scenario in Iran that has yet to be sort of integrated into global environmental history. So that was the sort of first attempt, or the first sort of foray into environmental history that sort of prompted this book. And I was interested especially in kind of thinking theoretically, or kind of creatively, about how we can relate a story of how people and their environments interact. And so I borrowed heavily in this book from the field of environmental history, and specifically the discipline of actor network theory, which essentially makes the case that in order to integrate environments, one method of doing this is to explore how people are connected to non-human elements of their environments in order to accomplish various work. So thinking of agriculture as not just farmers and tax collectors and systems of land tenure, but a convergence of people and animals and plants and water and soil and climate and microbes as all participants in a common shared process. So the book begins with an anecdote about Iran in the 1660s, where we have this strange situation of a recoronation of Shah Safi II as Suleiman I. So he was coronated in 1666 as Shah Safi II. And in those 2 years intervening, there was a sudden surge of famine, of disease epidemics, of Uzbek tribal groups penetrating the eastern frontiers of the empire. The Shah himself was suffering from venereal disease. And so what was interesting about this moment was that all of the chronicle works, the official histories of the Safavid Empire, which are written by typically upper-class urban men and connected to institutions of power, all of a sudden really interested in things happening in rural and pastoral communities that tend to be kind of absent from those sources. But they begin tracing these famine and disease epidemics and things that start to impinge upon their worlds. So in 1668, in order to sort of solve that crisis, or to address this convergence of problems that was happening around the empire, they do basically what your IT department will tell you to do when your laptop is on the fritz. They turn it off and turn it back on again, right? They recoronate the Shah at a different hour, and try to they basically blame the astrologers for setting this up poorly, and try to sort of kickstart the empire again by turning it off and turning it back on again. It doesn't exactly work. In fact, most historians kind of point back to this time, the 1660s, as the kind of the beginnings of the end of the Safavid period. But this book then kind of follows up on this article that I wrote with Jim Spear, and looks at the kind of longer term effects of this, which is really just the beginning of a really fascinating story about the relationship between communities in Iran and their environments. The decisive factor, like with other case studies on the Little Ice Age crisis, is the way that people respond to the crisis. And in fact, it allows us to kind of reframe a lot of 18th and 19th century histories around some environmental problems that are kind of the long after effect of this. So for instance, like a lot of the biographies and histories of Nader Shah focus on him being a kind of bright spot in the 18th century, someone who creates this last Indo-Persian empire and has this very successful military career. But when kind of reframing it around a time of dire environmental crisis, where the population levels and production levels in Iran are severely declining and communities are in crisis, we see, actually the project of creating the world's largest military and extracting large amounts of grain, resources, and animals from communities in crisis actually just drives that crisis deeper. So the second part of the book then deals with the Qajar period and the attempts by the Qajars to sort of reconstruct or reassemble empire. And it's organized around three broad but interconnected ecological zones. The first being farms and villages, so looks at the sort of state of productivity on farms and population levels, and kind of gives an alternative vision of how empire works around a flow of resources. Secondly, there's a chapter on pastures and mobile pastoralists. And this was one of the pieces that I thought was most interesting in this book, is that it kind of defied my expectations. I would expect, pastoralists who sort of live on some of the most marginal lands to be disproportionately affected by climate change. But in fact, found something of the opposite to be true, that in fact, the mobility and adaptability of pastoral nomadic groups actually made some openings for pastoralists to move into somewhat better land, some of which had been abandoned by farming communities as people fled the country and as population levels declined. And in fact, there's this not just conflict, but actually overwhelmingly a pattern of reciprocity with the court. And in fact, this is about as far back, the 18th century and into the 19th centuries, where we can trace the creation of large tribal confederacies. It seems to be something that happens in tandem with the court. So it allows us to sort of reframe a little bit the history of pastoral nomadism in Iran as well as something that is not just a sort of stable, long-term, eternal feature of the Iranian plateau, or sort of unchanging communities while the world around it turns, but in fact are deeply involved in these processes and go through their own pretty significant reconfiguration. And finally, there is then a chapter on cities as in part hubs of imperial politics, where you have this well-documented sort of bargaining between the court and local elites, but also allows us to kind of explore the rich lives and connections that exist beyond empire. So cities act as a sort of hub for local elites, for landowners, for religious scholars, but also we see at the same time flows of resources that go beyond the connection to Tehran that we often see in the ways that we describe imperial history. So for instance, there's a lengthy piece of this chapter that deals with the flow of resources that is shaped by religious endowments between rural communities where you have large endowed properties, or sorry, bequeathed properties that feed a steady flow of resources into urban centers. And so we can see things beyond those imperial networks that actually shape urbanism in Iran. There's also, of course, trade connections. In fact, conditioned by a devastating epidemic on the silkworm populations in the 1860s, there's a sort of cycle of export commodities, export trades that develop in the 1860s and 1870s, starting with things like cotton, which had already been sort of an export trade going back a few decades, but now becomes something of like a large scale monoculture cropping operation. We also have opium production as pictured here in this image. this all kind of creates changing relationships with the land and also a massive expansion of urban control over rural land holdings that seems to advance over the course of the 19th century. And of course, things like the carpet trade actually bring about an even more dramatic reconfiguration of the flow of resources between rural, pastoral, and urban communities, where you now have the convergence of things like wool and dyes and the expertise of master weavers and child labor and urban funding and global commercial ties all sort of converge to reconfigure the way people relate to their environments and the flow of resources between communities. So it allows for a sort of rich reimagining of how we tell sort of histories of empire and of social history in Iran around networks and assemblages. And like with most environmental histories, there's a strong global element to this as well. And of course, thinking about the ways that new infrastructures and new connectivities reshape Iran. So we have, for instance, in the 19th century, the telegraph concessions and telegraph construction across the country that cuts a corridor across time and space and reduces the time and expense for movement of goods and information and a greater base of knowledge to work from. You have railways and steamships that actually cut transportation times and connectivity, the cost and the time involved pretty dramatically. And this has actually an impact very deeply on the way people see themselves and their communities. One of the most interesting sets of sources that I worked with was this boom of geographical texts that appear right around this time in the 1860s, 1870s, early 1880s, where the Qajar court, in attempting to create a massive sort of compendium of geographical knowledge of all towns and villages in the country, they sent out questionnaires to local elites and asked them to respond with like, what sorts of things are being produced? Who are the elites in the community that we would have to negotiate with? Listing of all the villages and population levels and this sort of rich body of information they were trying to draw out. And instead, people write back in the language of geography to express their sort of local unities, their kind of local identities. So rather than a single geographical treatise covering Iran as an abstract, what we have instead is a collection of documents about the community of Tabriz and the community of Isfahan and Kerman and Kashan that each tell a kind of distinct story about local identity and relationships between people and the land. The final section of the book, I know I'm running out of time here, but the last section of the book deals with environmental crises, and especially in the late 19th century, where, of course, this is all taking place in the context of new 19th century problems, some of those shaped by the new connectivities brought by infrastructure. So, for instance, in Amir Afkhami's book on Iran's experience with cholera, says a lot of this was actually shaped by these new commercial networks that allowed for the more rapid spread of disease from this originating from India. Iran becomes one of the major sort of vectors for the transmission of cholera into Europe and across Eurasia. And this, of course, had a devastating impact upon Iran itself. And of course, other types of environmental hazards like earthquakes and famine, we see pretty consistently overlap with systems of inequality, and in fact, disproportionately affect people in marginal situations. Even things like earthquakes that seem sort of indiscriminate disproportionately affected people living in, say, mud brick housing, which was a popular building material for especially the urban poor. So all of this sort of converges into, like in much of the 19th century world, kind of new expectations of government. Some of this expressed as like tyranny, as being something that conflicts with Iran's natural development. This is from one of the modernist newspapers in the constitutional period. There's a force of nature guiding all societies of the world, much like disease conflicts with the nature of the human body, such is tyranny contrary to nature. So there's this kind of rich discussion of like tyranny is an obstruction to Iran's natural progress. And interesting too that there's this discussion about development and modernism and capitalism that's actually like also critical of the forms of capitalism that exist not just within Europe, but the types that are kind of impinging upon their world in the form of things like economic concessions that seem to be extracting wealth from Iranian land and Iranian labor and enriching capitalists in the West. One of the most interesting pieces of kind of discussion around capitalism from the newspaper Bahar in 1910 offered this sort of critique of political economy and of Adam Smith's theories of wealth, and argues that in fact capitalism has the tendency to create concentrations of wealth among the wealthy and further marginalize the poor. The capitalists of Europe have more wealth invested around the world than that which would meet the needs of the whole continent. But if you travel around Europe, you'll see that most people are still mired in poverty, and that which constitutes wealth is in the hands of these capitalists. And so it kind of sums up then, or it sort of wraps around then to the bookend to the environmental crises of the late Safavid period to talk about the rise of Reza Khan. And I make the argument here that there's a sort of backdrop, an environmental backdrop to this that's crucial to understanding the rise of authoritarian modernization, the sorts of problems that are being expressed in the constitutional period around inequality and around the inability of the Qajar state to confront 19th century challenges like cholera epidemics and environmental disasters, famine. This is the sort of backdrop to the claims that Reza Khan makes for an authoritarian alternative. So we have between 1911 and 1921, in this 10-year period, the faltering of the constitutional revolution, a British occupation, and of course Russian occupation at the beginning of the war, of the First World War, that in fact feeds into prioritizing the war effort over local concerns, which creates the worst famine in Iran's modern history, where at least 2 million people perish. And that, of course, like with most famines, people don't die of hunger, but rather of famine-related diseases. And there was a sort of perfect storm of this with the spread of the global influenza pandemic, which hit Iran quite hard between 1918 and 1920. So that all starts to make a little bit more sense. What happens with the Reza Shah coup in 1921, we see this as the sort of culmination of a long period of environmental crises, in fact, that we can trace back to the late Safavid period. So part of what I wanted to do with this book is sort of, think about how the 18th and 19th centuries up to World War I even are a sort of unified transitional period in Iran's environmental history and open up some new lines of research. I know it's sort of a sweeping text in the sense that I'm covering 2 centuries. And I didn't exactly set out to write a revisionist history of Iran, but I know it does grapple with some big questions about global inequality and our relationships with environment that do challenge some norms in the field. So above all else, I always feel like having good questions is important, maybe even more so than having great answers. And my hope is that this book will spark a conversation in the development of a rich field of Iranian environmental history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic overview, James. I now invite Dr. Afshin Marashi, Professor and Farzaneh Family Chair in Modern Iranian History at the University of Oklahoma, to share his thoughts on the book. His research focuses on the cultural and intellectual history of 19th and 20th century Iranian nationalism in its comparative, transnational, and global contexts. Afshin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm really glad to be able to join you. Thanks as well to Farima Mustafi and Shiva Tabai Nejad for organizing this event, and of course to James for bringing us all together. I'm going to try to keep my comments brief because I'm eager to hear from Camille and Belle and all of you watching on Zoom. But let me try to make a few general points, echoing some of what James already started, but try to add to the conversation a bit. But first of all, I do want to congratulate James. This book really is an outstanding achievement, and it's a very important contribution to the field of modern Iranian history. And I think one of the book's many strengths is actually it's written in a style that's very lucid and clear and accessible. And I think that's something we should all be striving for in the field. And that will, I think, also help to help the book find a wide audience, both in and out of academia. But James's book also adds a great deal of new ideas and creative new interpretations to, I guess, what we might call some of the age-old debates in the field of modern Iranian historiography. And these new interpretations come from an environmental history perspective that James has very effectively utilized in the book. As he argues, when we do look at Iran's modern history through the lens of environmental history, it's surprising how many new interpretations we can make, often of histories that we thought we already knew. This is perhaps, I think, the book's most significant achievement is this sort of fresh perspective that it brings to some perhaps familiar history. And I guess in that sense, it really is revisionist. Let me just give you a few examples from the book that just stood out for me as I was reading it over the last few days. And there are many others to choose from. Some of this overlaps with what James already suggested. For example, the decline and fall of the Safavid Empire in the 18th century. Conventional accounts usually point to the personal corruption of the Safavid court as the primary cause, and we read this from Chardin's accounts to Persian language histories, and this actually works its way into our modern historiography as well. More recent explanations have looked at economic arguments, pointing to the influx of New World silver and inflation as well. James acknowledges all of these factors, but he also takes into account something new, which is climate change in the 18th century, and something that he calls the little ice age of that time. This is a term I concede was new to me. This was, of course, a sustained period of cooling that caused disruption to agricultural production and multiple crop failures over an extended period of time that he talks about in the book. As James argues, this undermined the Safavid Empire's authority, which had been sustained in part through the practice of redistribution of surplus agriculture. Managing this system of agricultural productivity was central to Safavid and later to Qajar authority. It involved managing what James calls an assemblage, and that's maybe a term we can talk more about, of both human and non-human factors, and the need to keep these things in balance for the whole system to work. And when this assemblage is out of balance, the system breaks down. And this is exactly what happened in the 18th century during the Little Ice Age. And it is this environmental shift in climate that has been overlooked in considering the fall of the Safavids. I should also add on this point that James is very clear that he's not making a monocausal argument. This is not a deterministic ecological framework of environmental history. And rather, James is clear to argue that there is a combination of non-human factors, in this case, climate, and human factors, we might say poor governance, that combine together to produce the fall of the Safavids. There are many other examples in the book of this kind of novel reading of Iran's modern history through a kind of ecological environmental lens. Let me just try to give you a couple of more. James actually argues that the rise of the Qajars and the new imperial system that they were able to create came about in part because of the end of the Little Ice Age and a return to at least a short-term period of climate normalcy. as he describes for the 19th century in a balance between village life, pastoralism, and the cities, which was restored for a time, until the second half of the 19th century, when a new series of environmental and ecological challenges once again reshape Iran's history. In this case, as he began discussing earthquakes, famines, and the spread of disease. These kinds of climate events rarely make it into our narratives of modern Iran. If they do, they're usually described as episodic and really not central to our discussion or to our narratives. The usual narratives of the later 19th century, as that history is usually told in terms of Russian and British imperialism, failed efforts at Qajar state building, or maybe the spread of new revolutionary ideas entering into Iran's political language, usually from European sources. James doesn't discount that kind of history, but he also puts them in a larger context, which is the environmental and ecological challenges that the Qajar dynasty also faced. For example, the famine of 1870, 1872, which doesn't really make it into our usual narratives of the 19th century. Its severity made it impossible for the Qajar state to provide relief, to redistribute resources, and ultimately made the state appear that much weaker. Other factors that we usually discuss in terms of the 19th century, Iran's 19th century, is integration into the global economy. But James has a kind of environmental interpretation of this. The global economy not only disrupted domestic cottage industries and produced shifts in agricultural cultivation towards cash crops, that much I think is generally integrated into narratives of 19th century Iran. But just as importantly, the integration into the global economy also meant access to new transportation systems, especially steamships and rail. And these new systems of transportation facilitated the movement of commodities and peoples, and for cultural intellectual historians like me, facilitated the circulation of ideas. But these new transportation systems also facilitated the spread of viruses and disease. And this had catastrophic consequences, including mass depopulation. Readers of James's book will learn a great deal about Iran's history of cholera in the 19th century, which doesn't usually make it into our conventional accounts of 19th century Iran. We're much more used to talking about the history of the Great Game, but that's only part of the 19th century. Similarly, examples of economic concessions. James has a kind of environmental interpretation of concessions as well. The tobacco revolt in 1890, 1891 is perhaps the best example of this. The story is usually told as an example of European economic imperialism and the selling off of Iran's tobacco economy by Nasser-Din Shah. Or sometimes the story is told as the protest against the concession as an early example of the political assertiveness of the Shiite clerisy, or even as a political foreshadow or a dress rehearsal for 1905. What we learn from James's book is something a little bit different. In addition to economic imperialism and clerical activism, the protest against the tobacco concession was also the start of a changing conception of how Iranians were beginning to see their collective rights over their natural resources and their collective environmental patrimony. As James argues, this was part of a transition to a new national understanding of the relationship between a people and the land. And sometimes we might think of the oil nationalization movement of the 1950s in those terms, but really we can make a connection with the tobacco protest as being a foreshadow of Mossadegh rather than maybe only a foreshadow of 1905. I'm going to try to stop there because that's in the interest of time, but let me end where James ends the book and the discussion of the rise of Reza Shah. And James also has an environmental argument to explain this as well. which might sound strange because our usual arguments about the emergence of Reza Shah is a kind of political interpretation. We sometimes usually discuss the retreat of the Russian Cossack officers in the aftermath of the 1917 Russian Revolution and the rise of Reza Khan. We might talk about British imperial interests in the wake of World War I to explain the rise of Reza Khan. But James points to something else, and he brings us back to this sort of what has strangely fallen out of our conventional narratives of the rise of Reza Shah, which is, as he describes, the famine of 1915 to 1919 and the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, which were really apocalyptic in their devastation. And as James argues, in addition to the politics, it's this environmental or public health context that also enabled the rise of an authoritarian figure like Reza Khan in 1921. I'll stop there, but clearly what we have here is an original, instructive, I would say a revisionist rereading of Iran's modern history in light of the environmental challenges that Iran faced and continues certainly to face in the modern period. And I'll stop there, but I look forward to the conversation. And I think we have James to thank for adding a whole new dimension to our understanding. So thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much for those comments, Afshin. And the term the Little Ice Age was also new to me. I really learned so much from this book, and I look forward to chatting more about the threads of how the book revises some of those major historiographical debates in Iranian history that you mentioned during our discussion. First, I invite Dr. Camille Cole, Assistant Professor of History at Illinois State University, to share her thoughts on The Lion and the Sun. Her research focuses on histories of capitalism, law, and the environment across Qajar Iran, Ottoman Iraq, and the Persian Gulf. Camille.
Thanks so much, Belle, for the introduction. Thank you. I really want to thank James for inviting me to participate in this event and giving me an opportunity to read the book. And thank you to all of you for being here, to the organizers. So I want to also start by saying I hope I will not repeat too much of what James and Afshin have already said. But if I do, just know that it's because some of the things that this book does are really striking and worth talking about multiple times. And so I want to congratulate James on this book. One of the things it does is synthesize a huge amount of existing scholarship, including environmental histories of Iran and also the work of many people who I'm sure do not see themselves as environmental historians. And as James said, one of the things that I find really valuable about environmental history is how it can offer us new frames and new ways of looking at things that we thought we already knew. So I'm mainly a historian of the Ottoman Empire. I also work on the Ottoman and Qajar borderlands, particularly in Basra and Khuzestan. So what I want to talk about today is three things that I saw the book doing, three interventions that I saw it making, and how they connect to recent scholarship on the Ottoman Empire. These interventions are in the periodization of Iranian history, in the conceptualization of empire, and in the historiography of the Little Ice Age, which is a term that I did know, but not one that I've researched myself that much. Anyway, okay, so let me start with periodization. So in Iranian history, as James points out in the book, we have a tendency to draw lines between the Safavid period, the 18th century, and the Qajar period. And in particular, I think we often treat the 18th century as a kind of lost era or an anomaly. And it's that kind of lostness that splits the Safavid and the Qajar literatures from each other. And so James, part of what he argues in the book is that we should instead understand the Iran that develops in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as being possible because of the long aftermath of the Little Ice Age, which he basically suggests was, a major factor in the fall of the Safavids. Then the political turmoil and the demands of rival leaders in the 18th century prolonged the Little Ice Age crisis, and the Qajar imperialism in the 19th century was mainly working to kind of overcome the problems that emerged from it, only to then face a new set of challenges. So I think this argument is useful in part in how it pushes us to understand the history of Iran as one of continuity in addition to change. So rather than kind of relitigating the question of decline, this allows us to ask new questions about how, for example, the early Qajars responded to the specific conditions they faced around the turn of the 19th century. This is something that other scholars, people like Asif Ashraf and Kevin Gledhill, are exploring, but what James is doing is a little bit different because he's focused on the environmental aspect. So the notion of decline, right? This is something that's really common across the literatures on the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottoman empires. But something that's always been really striking to me is how different recent work on the question of decline is across these empires. The most obvious reason for this is, of course, that Ottoman rule did not end in the 18th century. And so part of what this has done in the Ottomanist literature is that Ottomanists have kind of moved in the last 20 years to focus on the different ways that statecraft and imperial power operated over the long history of empire, including thinking about how periods of what we often call centralization and decentralization emerged from and built on each other. So, how was the Ottoman Empire localized? How were elites Ottomanized at different points in Ottoman history? Ottomanists generally are interested in kind of excavating how continuity and change come together. And so, without discounting the real differences between Safavid and Qajar history on the one hand and Ottoman history on the other, I think that James's work in this book offers us a really important invitation to comparison, in part by looking at the long history of empire in Iran as something incorporating both continuity and change, rather than basically constituting multiple separate histories. Okay, so that leads me to my next intervention, which is about the idea of empire. James offers us a conceptualization of empire which emphasizes the management of resource flows and people across different kinds of ecologies. For the Qajars and also the Safavids, but mostly the Qajars, that required various kinds of arrangements with elites. And that's something that lots of scholars on the Qajar period have shown. But what James does that's new is he shows us that taking the non-human seriously can help us think about these elite bargains as ecological and think across different kinds of imperial ecologies. And so this is where I really saw a ton of resonances with recent work on the Ottoman Empire. And I'm going to call out a couple of specific works. I know it's kind of odd to talk about other books, but there's just so much. There's so many things that ways these things speak to each other. So the first one I want to mention is Faisal Hussein's Rivers of the Sultan. This is an environmental history of the Ottoman Tigris and Euphrates. And although Faisal is mostly focused on an earlier period, like James, he's interested in the question of how Ottoman rule was often about managing flows of resources and people across ecologies. So empire is important in part because of how it puts these ecologies into conversation. And we can also see similar ideas in some of Alan McHale's early work on Ottoman Egypt in the early modern period. The second book I want to mention is Zozan Pehlivan's Political Ecology of Violence. So one of the things that James explores is how different ecologies, particularly agricultural and pasture ecologies, were differentially affected by crisis, right? So different ways of life were impacted unequally by things like drought and famine. This led to a shifting balance and in some cases imbalance between different ecologies and different ways of life. And so in her book, Zozan is also interested in state responses to crisis, in particular, quote unquote, natural disasters. And she shows that crises like drought and cold affected agriculturalists and pastoralists differently. And then Ottoman relief measures intensified those differences. Obviously, again, there are some differences here, but the two works address a similar set of conceptual questions about how imperial priorities, often around tax collection, can generate policies with differential ecological and social impacts, which then have further implications for imperial government. Okay, and then the last one I want to mention is Noor Barakat's Bedouin Bureaucrats. So one of the arguments that James makes in the book is that when the Qajars talked about restoring order, what they were mostly talking about was developing new relationships with elites, including tribal elites. And he talked, and he mentioned earlier that the major kind of tribal confederations that we know from 19th and 20th century travelers and anthropologists can't really be reliably traced earlier than the Qajar period. In Bedouin Bureaucrats, Nora is also showing how the category of tribe was invented and redefined in the 19th century through Ottoman projects of imperial reordering. So like the Qajar state, the Ottomans were interested in using tribal elites to do the day-to-day business of government, especially tax collection. And a lot of that, again, is about managing the flow of resources. Of course, again, there are a lot of differences. The Ottoman state is much more bureaucratic than the Qajar state in the 19th century, but elite bargains remained really, really central, particularly when we're talking about marginal ecologies. So there was a lot more works that I could bring up. I'm going to try to keep this to maybe 2 more minutes. But even just these works, I think can show us kind of important comparisons between the Ottomans and the Qajars as far as how imperial power operated by bringing different ecologies into conversation, how this balance fared in the face of natural, quote unquote, crises, which affected different ecologies differently, and how imperial states tried to cope with disorder by forging new relationships with elites, with long-term effects on both the environment and on how we conceptualize community and identity. So in other words, right, what does power look like in empire? How does it work? What challenges it? And how does an environmental lens help us understand this in new ways? So beyond just the kind of fact of comparison, although I think it's really important that we do more comparison between the Ottoman and the Qajar empires, I think opening up this conversation is important for the broader idea of empire and imperialism. To kind of like generalize wildly, in the Ottoman historiography, I think the main thrust of the literature on imperialism over the last 2 decades or so has been to ask how Ottoman imperialism was or was not similar to European imperialisms. What were the Ottomans borrowing? What was unique? In the Qajar historiography, I think often the driving question is, was it an empire or is it just leading into the nation state of Iran? Again, like with decline, I think part of the difference is about the different fates of the Ottoman and Qajar lands in the 20th century. It's easy for us to see the Qajar lands as Iran and therefore as national rather than imperial. James argues pretty clearly that we ought to think about Qajar history as imperial. I agree with that. And so then I think the next question is, what does that mean? And what I want to suggest is that thinking about the Ottoman and the Qajar experience together, instead of thinking about each alone or primarily in conversation with Europe, can help us generate new ways of talking and thinking about imperial power, even beyond the Middle East. Okay, lastly, and very briefly, I want to mention the historiography of the Little Ice Age. So often I think in work on the Little Ice Age, we see either arguments about success or about failure, right? Many scholars, including in the Ottoman context, have connected the Little Ice Age to social unrest and social crisis. On the other hand, we have works like the Frigid Golden Age, right, which show how Dutch resilience in the face of climate change helped produce the Dutch Golden Age, failure and success. But the history that James tells here is about both success and failure, right? He shows that Safavid imperial systems were resilient. They were successful for a time in coping with various kinds of climate stress. But resilience is always trade-offs. And so ultimately we see how those stresses made the Safavids vulnerable to a relatively small military force. And so rather than a Little Ice Age crisis, Iran suffers a post-Little Ice Age crisis kind of as human actions made existing demographic and environmental challenges much worse. And so what's useful about this, and Afshin also mentioned this, is how it highlights, the ways that human systems can interact with non-human ones over very long time frames. And I think this is particularly important in the context of Middle Eastern history. Historians of the Middle East have often been very wary of environmental and other determinisms. Orientalism casts a long shadow. But in tracing how people first mitigated the effects of climate change and then made them much worse, James clearly shows how non-human nature can play different kinds of historical roles without being determinative. So there's room for human agency in this environmental history. I think it is in fact a deeply human history, even as it's also making room for a wide range of non-human agencies. I'll stop there. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Camille. And I invite James and Afshin to join us with their cameras off. Perfect. So Camille, you've highlighted to me what is such an important aspect of the book, that it both uses environmental history as a way to impact and sort of revise Iranian history, but also uses that history of Iran to better understand elements of broader environmental history, the historiography of the Little Ice Age, for example. So thinking along these lines, I'd like to ask each of you to reflect a little bit more on how this book does, in fact, really open the doors to establishing a field in Iranian environmental history and furthers approaches to environmental history on the whole. There's already a relatively established field of environmental history of the Middle East, as Camille noted, but how does The Lion and the Sun extend and complement and contribute to these histories? What more does a field of Iranian environmental history allow us to do? Afshin, I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly in the context of your own work on the connections between Iran and India in your recent book, Exile in the Nation. How might this contribute to histories and environmental histories of the Indian Ocean world? And Camille, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on how it contributes to larger regional environmental histories. You hinted there was more to discuss in relation to the Ottoman context, so I invite you to do so. So, Afshin, if you'd like to begin.
Well, I mean, I can just say a couple of things. When I was reading the book, it made me kind of remember some of the things I was reading in my sources that I had just sort of skipped over. For example, travel between Iran and India, yeah, people would get sick. And, I wouldn't think too much about it because I was more interested in, the flow of ideas that were flowing back and forth. Sometimes I would read in some of the sources where people would approach Bushehr and they would have to sort of sit on the boat in quarantine because there would be some kind of quarantine arrangement before people would be allowed to deboard and come to shore. They would have to be on the boat for some period. I'd never really thought of that, but I guess that was some kind of resilience that they had built in to account for these kinds of things. I mean, at the very least, I mean, rereading our sources or having our attention focused on things that we might typically overlook, that's sort of one methodological approach that I think James has really demonstrated how to approach our source material in new ways. I mean, that's one thing. The other thing, as I tried to say, all of this really does question and challenge in a kind of productive, creative, revisionist way so much of what we have sort of, standardized in terms of our reading of our interpretations of the 19th century and of the Safavid period. I mean, I think this book should definitely be on syllabi. It should be on field exam reading lists, that kind of thing for graduate programs. And I think bringing it into the conversation like we're doing today, I think that's also a way of integrating this into establishing it as a much more important field or subfield within Iranian studies as part of the mainstream of our understandings.
Okay, please excuse also my cat who has entered the chat. Hopefully she won't be too disruptive. Okay, so there's so many ways I think there's so many ways to answer this question. One thing I think that this work does that's really valuable in terms of thinking about environmental history as a genre is it's thinking about the environment in a lot of ways, right? Like a lot of environmental historians do energy history, or they do agriculture, or they do climate. And one of the things that this book does is it actually does all of those things. It's not just saying like, what is the role of the climate in Iranian history? It's thinking about the climate, but it's also thinking about various other kinds of relationships that humans and non-human nature have. And I think that I think as a kind of methodological note for environmental historians, that's really useful. One other thing that I wanted to work into my earlier remarks, but then I couldn't figure out how to fit it, was the part that James mentioned about Vakf, because I thought this was such an interesting part of the book in terms of thinking about how Vakf both organizes resources and space in rural areas, connects across multiple kinds of ecology, and then organizes material and organizes space in cities. And I think this is something that we can, this is something that certainly we can see across contexts. One thing that can make comparison difficult is the different kinds of sources that we have in different places, right? The Ottoman archives are very rich in many ways, and like we're extremely lucky to have them, but they you know, I think in some ways, if you work on Iranian history, you have to be more creative because you don't have, you know, just 600 straight years of bureaucratic record keeping to go on. But so I think that kind of I think that this anyway, thinking about Waqf as something that's shared across, you know, a wide stretch of the Islamic world could be a way to think about this kind of ecological history across many kinds of space. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you. And yes, if any of my students are in the audience, you will be reading this book in the spring. It is already on my syllabus. We already have a couple of questions in the chat, but I do have a couple of questions myself first. So for those of you in the audience who would like to get in the lineup of questions, please do put your questions in the Q&A function, and I will be reading them out soon. But first, James, both Camille and Afshin have mentioned sources, and you talked a bit about the sources that you used, using old sources in new and creative ways, ones that people have relied on for other sorts of histories. And you also mentioned new sources that I'd say you're also using incredibly creatively, those tree rings. I love them. It was just mind-blowing. So especially as we do have students in our audience today, where can you see them taking this field? What kind of sources and also methods do you see as untapped and possible avenues for further exploration? And perhaps speak a bit more about your method of assemblage theory as well, which I found to be very effective.
Thank you for all of the comments, the very thoughtful, insightful commentary on the book. I really appreciate it. And the question of sources is, I think, a really interesting one. In fact, the first draft of this book, anyone who's ever written something monograph length knows that it goes through cycles of death and rebirth. And the first version of this was actually organized around how you can use different types of source materials to kind of dig out different types of stories. And so there was a section entirely on just land grants and imperial orders, and one that was entirely on endowments. And I think that actually kind of maps somewhat neatly onto the ways some of the book is still organized, in that there's sections that deal largely with, you know, farms and villages, and some that deal with pastoralism and use the anthropological literature and stuff. But I think above all, if there was one thing that I would want to sort of put out there methodologically, is that human history is sort of wrapped up in a much larger story that we often ignore to our own peril. I think there's a great sensitivity within the field of environmental history towards environmental determinism. I know Camille Cole already spoke to this a little bit about the real sort of sensitivity towards like monocausal explanations of just, you have climate change and it has these predictable effects. So there's always this end of like being careful not to discount human agency. But on the other hand, like the opposite has sort of taken hold almost as a sort of unchallenged orthodoxy within the field of history, that we tend to treat human agency as sort of sitting atop its environments and its contexts, and that you can sort of like understand historical change without reference to non-human participants. So that's what I think is most useful about like well, aspects of Bruno Latour and other environmental historians and actor network theorists, is that it kind of allows you to think about, yes, human agency, but human agency is sort of operates alongside other sorts of non-human things. It really, like the example I gave in the beginning of like trying to understand agriculture without sort of integrating the biology of plants or the labor of animals or the quality or salinization of soil or changes to the climate. You only get a little piece of the picture, and we've actually sort of trained ourselves to think of human beings as sort of sitting above and outside of other elements of nature. So that just that's a small change in some ways, right? Of like expanding the scope of what we think of as relevant historical actors. I think as a small but important one that starts to attune you to other types of things. And just I've also relied on the advice and the scholarship of a great number of people that I respect a lot. So this semester I'm at Georgetown teaching a seminar on environmental history of Iran. And so I called in every favor from every friend I could think of to try to get people to come in and talk about their research. And so we're reading a bunch of books on cholera, on the Trans-Iranian Railway, on water rights, on all sorts of things. And in most cases, when I'm reaching out to people and telling them, you know, you're on my syllabus for Iranian environmental history, they never really thought of their work in that way as like being environmental history. But there's actually quite a bit of environmental history adjacent things that are fascinating and kind of pull together into a sort of alternative story of modern Iranian history. So in part, yes, I mean, there's a lot of original primary source research and stuff in this book, but it also is like developed in dialogue with a lot of people doing fascinating work, and not just in Iranian studies, but in Ottoman studies as well, and in Mughal history and global environmental studies.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it seemed like there's a lot of social history as well as political economy that I thought I was reading into the book. As you know, that it's a broadly conceived understanding of what environmental history is, that it includes all these other things too.
Yeah.
Very much so. So this actually dovetails very nicely with one question from the audience about what other sort of related fields that, James, as you mentioned, are sort of touching on environmental history, but maybe aren't explicitly considered such. How are those related? How do those impact your own work and how you are approaching this particular history? The audience member notes that in architectural history, for example, there's an increasing emphasis on environmental questions, and even anthropologists have also long highlighted the ecological dimensions of tribal life.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think there's a very big umbrella that you can carry with environmental history. I'm trying to find the right metaphor. Very broad tent, I think, that you can claim a lot of other types of work under within things like built environment, and thinking about like, I mean, you can, in a way, you can think of like architecture as a form of like domesticating space, in the same way that we domesticate animals and plants and sort of attribute new meanings to them. And built environment is very straightforwardly, you know, part of urban environmental history. And there's a lot of really fascinating work going on, especially in like 20th century environmental history, that touches more specifically on some of the specific issues that were raised in that question. And I would highlight also that there was this fantastic dissertation published in the last couple of years by Amit Sadan, who was here in the audience a bit ago, working on Pahlavi environmental history, and engages with a lot of those questions about infrastructural development and development projects in the Pahlavi period. So there's some momentum. And actually, at our conference in Utrecht in 2026, there are at least 2 full panels on Iranian environmental history. So there's a little bit of momentum of trying to nudge people into thinking of themselves as at least environmental history adjacent.
Great. Another audience member asks if you are engaging with Persian language established scholarship in environmental history, and how that might be influencing your work and thought as well.
Yeah, there's actually like a pretty rich literature within Persian on, of course, beyond the body of source materials and, you know, 18th and 19th century work. There's also people within Iran and Iranian scholars working abroad in Canada and the US and Europe, doing really fascinating research. And I mean, I'd highlight, for example, of course, the works of Mohammed Ibrahim Bastani Parisi, who's actually one of my kind of first forays into thinking about Iranian environmental history was a conversation with him late in his life when I was working on my book on Kerman. He's from the city of Kerman and wrote a lot of the foundational works in the history of Kerman, and had an opportunity to kind of talk about that with him. And so much of his work on like siyasat va iqtisad was like in the Safavid period was a really foundational work for kind of rethinking a lot of core issues. I relied upon also a lot of scientific work in the Persian language, talking about things like grasses and disease, and tried to kind of bring in as broad of a view of Iranian environmental history as possible. Of course, you have people like Kaveh Mahdani working on water rights issues, writing in English, but I mean, there's no less Iranian. So there's a lot of, I think, a lot of really fascinating work out there. But I mean, the vast majority of the primary source materials for this book were challenging to work with. I think that's what kind of drew me to Iranian studies in the first place. And my initial training was largely in economic history. I like a good spreadsheet, and I like detail-oriented things. So working in things like geographical treatises, they're not always like your fun beach read, but they're like full of really interesting insights on how people related to their environments and how land use was changing. And there's all these little nuanced things if you can kind of take a broad view of the material and look at some issues that maybe aren't straightforwardly in the text, but are certainly in there if you're asking those kinds of questions. I don't know if that fully addresses the question, but I know the question was sort of asking about the kind of range of Persian sources used in the text, and certainly both in the primary and secondary sources, I try to have a broad view as possible of just trying to answer questions with the resources available to us, no matter where that might lead you.
Very much so. So thinking of possible avenues for further exploration, I have a question I'd like to pose to all three of you that also ties into a couple of questions that we have from audience members. So one comment was the environmental devastation that we see in Iran now is no less than a question of the future survival of the country. Camille, one of your articles is titled The Radical Instability of the Present, and it looks at the relationship between infrastructure and the environment, and how both the past, present, and future really take shape in discussions of a new railway and irrigation in Ottoman Iraq. The framing of your article along this question of the radical instability of the present, in my mind, really connects to James' preface, where he reflects on protests in Isfahan in 2021, protests that were about the drying of the river due to diversion of water that was supposed to support the city. You both have these very similar threads of human interference in the environment due to possible futures having these very tangible and oftentimes adverse impacts on the present. And I want to ask all of you, especially all as historians here, to reflect on this radical instability of the present as we think about what it means to develop and further this field of Iranian environmental history. How does this approach in particular help us see how the past has contributed to present instabilities as possible futures become even more uncertain?
Wow, I really should probably be prepared to talk about my own work and not just someone else's work, but I have to admit I wasn't expecting it. It's okay. So yeah, so I think this is, I think talking about the future is always a little bit fraught for historians, like some disciplines, right? Economists are all about the future. It's all about predicting what's going to happen. And I think as historians, we're often caught in a place where We want to think that our work thinking about the past is important to understanding the present and thinking about the future. But then if anybody asks us, well, what's going to happen? We don't really want to answer that. We don't want to get put on the spot. But I guess, so in the article that you mentioned, part of what I'm interested in is how our ideas about what the future should look like and what we assume that it's going to look like affect how we act in the present, and how, and in particular, things like investments, infrastructures, and ways of engaging with the environment. Often those are things that have a long time frame, and we know that they're going to have a long time frame. And so we have to be thinking about the future is always a kind of it's acting in the present, which is kind of an odd way to think about it. But I also want to say, I also think like part of what you were referring to that James talks about in the introduction to the book is that in order to imagine a different kind of future, we need to be able to think about the past in a different way. And I think this is another way of coming at this question, right? If the future is acting in the present and our experience of the past affects what we think might happen in the future, in order to be able to imagine the future differently, we have to be able to think about the past differently. And I do think, I think that's really true. I think that in a lot of cases, we're seeing also like a kind of collapse of time frames, right? Where things that maybe seemed like they were going to be really far in the future, or things that in the United States still seem in some communities like they're far in the future, like climate collapse, in other places, particularly in some parts of Iran, are not far in the future. And I think that in some ways makes this question of like the relationship between the past, the future, and the present a lot more urgent and more difficult to deal with, which is not, which is another historian non-answer, but that's what I've got.
Well, thank you.
I can try to add a little bit to that. One of the things as I was reading James's book is it does end in 1921. And so it's a question about how to write the environmental history of Iran after 1921. And I know this is an active field of research, and there's probably dissertations and manuscripts in the works and in the pipeline. But I think that's sort of a question to bring the present in the context of what happens after 1921. And certainly James's book is a kind of foundational text in this regard. Whatever history of the 20th century after 1921 is written, I think we'll have to refer to this text. But I think one way of approaching it is the way that James approached his argument in this book, which is sort of the relationship between the human and the non-human. And sort of almost like a dialectic. And it seems as though if we think about how that relationship evolves after 1921, the human component really accelerates and expands. And we call that maybe development or developmentalism or modernization or infrastructure, all of those things. And I think that's sort of maybe one way of thinking about the more recent evolution of the environment is sort of the human intervention. And if we think about the present, well, the non-human or the climatic consequences of the human might be on the sort of threshold, if not already, returning into the equation. So I think if a historian's broad view, and maybe that's one thing that historians can bring, is to put the present or the near present into a larger framework. I think the framework of this interaction between the human and the non-human, I think it becomes much more urgent and much more dramatic and consequential after 1921.
Yes, thank you for the comments. And just to kind of return to thinking about the environmental politics of the present and future, it's a really interesting question. And I always try to center my work around questions of, especially with environmental history, of like environmental justice, of how we can use our understanding of the past to also kind of explore how unequal access to resources and unequal exposure to harm or environmental hazards have developed and shaped over time. And that's certainly true of considering things like environmental disasters in Iran today, the drying of Lake Urmia, the drastic water crisis in Khuzestan that, there's a prediction that within a couple of generations, a large section of southwestern Iran will be largely uninhabitable. But I think we also need to think beyond. Again, I think it's easy sometimes to get into a mode of thinking about climate change as a sort of single trigger and single cause with predictable outcomes that it's going to lead to, a certain predictable set of outcomes in each particular community, or water shortages as being, strictly about water scarcity. I would actually point to, I think maybe it's a brilliant essay that was published just after I sent in the final manuscript of this book, but there's this fabulous article by Jessica Barnes called Placing the Environment in Middle East Studies. And she makes a case in this about like the need to really trace cause and effect, especially when it comes to environments in the Middle East, beyond these sort of catastrophe narratives and scarcity narratives that, like, for instance, there's issues of access to water, water scarcity in Egypt, but she actually makes the case that it's not about absolute scarcity, it's about distribution of resources. And in fact, in some cases, Egypt is actually suffering from too much water, and it can kind of overwhelm the existing infrastructure, and then it's distributed in ways that benefit some people over others. But those choices are sometimes obscured. And in fact, the Egyptian government often has a vested interest in advancing a case of scarcity while it's involved in disputes over water rights on the Nile River, right? So we have to be really careful, I think, in attending to cause and effect, and not allowing that kind of creeping influence of like environmental catastrophe and disaster as a sort of monocausal trigger that leads to all of these conclusions. I think we have to be really careful in thinking about that. But certainly, I don't think you can understand the environmental problems in Iran today as being purely environmental or purely about environmental management in the Islamic Republic. There's often a whole series of processes and mechanisms and priorities that actually shape things like access to water. So in any case, they're challenging questions, but I mean, as historians, I think should always lead with good questions and use whatever evidence we can gather to sort of get at that from as many angles as possible.
Absolutely. So completing this thread, talking about sort of the present and the environment, one audience member asks if you, James, are in conversation with Iranian environmentalists living in Iran, and if so, what is their outlook on the current state of affairs in terms of the environmental movement?
I'm not so much in dialogue with like environmental activists today working in Iran, but I know the many Iranians that I know and speak with that are in the country do have, of course, great concerns over environmental issues. Of course, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book in particular in this moment was that, as Camille noted, like in order to have some frame of reference for environmental issues in the present, we need to have a kind of reconsideration of our past, or a different kind of past to draw from in order to understand current issues. So, I mean, I think I kind of spoke to that already a little bit, but like the scope of environmental problems in Iran today is also combined with other types of movements over issues of women's rights, over issues of minoritized communities, the rights of, say, the Kurdish minority in the northwest of Iran, of tribal groups. There's a large number of, there's a kind of convergence of these issues. Environmental issues and human rights issues are all sort of wrapped up together. And in fact, environmentalism is sort of a delicate subject, let's say, within the Islamic Republic today. for those exact reasons, because of these sorts of overlaps.
Moving back to history and the sources we use to figure it out, one audience member asks how you think this lens of environmental history might help us better understand produced material culture.
Maybe we could clarify what they mean by produced material culture.
My guess is that histories of material culture and sort of looking at objects and the production of them over time seems to very much relate to the available resources and how people are using them and the technologies available to harness those resources, if you will. I'm guessing that's what they're getting at, but I will keep an eye on the chat if they are willing to clarify if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one way that I do this in the book, I think there's lots of other of course avenues for this kind of investigation, but like the carpet trade is a good example, right, of the ways that this actually involves a kind of reconfiguration of relationships between different communities. So in the say 1880s, 1890s, there's this sudden demand for Oriental carpets in Western upper class households that leads to a depletion of the stock from a lot of the bazaars and local markets around Iran, largely from Azeri merchants from the northwest of Iran, kind of buy these all up and sell them in Europe or sell them to European merchants. And then there's this kind of sudden boom of investment in making new carpets. And in doing so, they have to sort of assemble an entirely new system of production that brings together like wool that was being exported in large amounts from southeastern Iran out to India is now sort of being redirected towards local productive practices. You have manufactories that are sort of hastily set up in cities around, especially like in the Kerman region, in Hamadan, and parts of Western Iran. But then also some shifts that were made. So things like the use of agricultural dyes quickly gives way to cheaper aniline dyes that are being imported from abroad because they were bright colors, they were cheaper, and by the time they fade in about 5 or 10 years, you've already made your money off of the consumer. So there's like, it sort of over the long term sort of hurts the reputation of Iranian carpets, but there's sort of like a series of steps. There's a series of like reorganizations that take place that have pretty wide impact on Iranian society. Like these are some of the first like sort of industrial wage labor jobs that are introduced into Iranian cities. A lot of it actually like child labor, but nonetheless, it's kind of the origins of like kind of factory wage labor in Iran comes from this very particular context. And it's a sort of, yes, a material culture issue, but it's also one of like kind of reconfiguring networks of people and non-human things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of a project that could grow out of this kind of research is, social history of textile manufacturing. It reminds me of actually an article written by my PhD advisor, Nikki Keddy, in the early 90s called Material Culture and Geography. It's in a volume edited by Wang Cole called Comparing Muslim Societies. And actually, when I was reading James's book, it reminded me of this article that I had read when I was, very early on. And I think that article really is a kind of progenitor to a lot of what James is picking up on here as well. So there is a kind of prehistory as well that James is really kind of picking up on. And I think that article in Material Culture and Geography and production and the social history of production, especially the textile industry, is definitely part of that environmental paradigm, if you will.
I think this example, I would definitely read this book on the carpets. I think that, like you should write it. Somebody should write it. Like that's very interesting. I think this question about material culture, you know, in some ways it connects back to the earlier question on the built environment, right? Like if we're thinking about the kind of the question of assemblages and actor network theory, obviously, like you can only do, you can only do so much in one book, but you know, when we're talking about like the human and the non-human, material culture is part of that. So lots of non-human things are not created by humans, but lots of non-human things are created by humans. And so I think that, I mean, and I think that the book does this, but it's also worth thinking about, you know, other directions to go with this kind of question, in terms of thinking of ways that human and non-human can be, you know, can be linked together and combined in lots of different ways, and how that changes over time.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we are out of time for this incredibly rich discussion. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists, Afshin and Camille, for such an engaging discussion. Thank you to James for this absolutely fantastic book. And thank you to the audience for such thoughtful questions. And thank you again to Georgetown's Persian Studies program for hosting this webinar today. Farima, Shiva, Lynn, and Jenon put so much into organizing this wonderful event. It's been a pleasure to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.